Okay, you all have had a number of invitations and opportunities to object to Aristotle's views in one way or another. That is, to identify potential problems with Aristotle's views. You've done that in some of the discussion boards, and I've occasionally in the slides and the video lectures, I've stopped to say, can you come up with any objections to this position or this argument? Okay, well now what I want to do is I want to just run through some common objections to Aristotle, and I think some particularly strong ones, and talk also about how Aristotle might reply to those objections. So first, just a little bit of terminology. This might be obvious, and I've kind of assumed that you had a sense of what these words meant as I went and occasionally define them, but I want to just explicitly define them here. So an objection is a criticism of some theoretical position or argument. It's a reason or reasons given for not agreeing with that position or that argument. A reply to an objection is a defense of the original position or argument, okay? And so a lot of what happens in ethics and in other branches of philosophy is we're not dealing with an experimental discipline. It's not like we can just go gather data and that will resolve our questions. We need to make arguments, and we need to sometimes be clever in how we construct arguments. We need to be creative and think carefully about what are the reasons for and against adopting or agreeing with any particular position. And so a lot of the way that ethical discussion goes, discussion in when you're debating about what should be done or what's the right normative ethical theory to adopt, is that people give arguments for their position, and then other people give objections to those arguments, and then the people originally making the arguments reply to the objections, and then it keeps going like that, kind of back and forth, okay? So what's an argument, just briefly? And again, this might be obvious, but it's worth just stating explicitly. So an argument basically is a set of claims where some of the claims are intended as support for another of the claims, okay? And by convention, we call the supported claim the conclusion or the main conclusion of the argument, and we call the supporting claims the premises. And sometimes there are kind of nested structures inside arguments. So there can be a kind of main conclusion that you want to get to by the end of the argument, but there can also be intermediate conclusions along the way that are kind of conclusions that are drawn from earlier premises and then in turn serve as support for further conclusions later on in the argument. You can also think of an argument as like a proof in geometry. Though many arguments aren't exactly intended to completely prove their conclusions, they're more intended to support them. But the basic structure of there being premises that are being appealed to or used in combination with each other to support conclusions is similar. And one more point to note just briefly is that arguments are all over the place, right? So there were arguments made in the Davis piece and in the Creasell piece, as well as objections and replies. And there are arguments made, there have been arguments made in many of the texts that we've read in the course. There are also arguments made in the sciences, often on the basis of data. So almost every scientific paper that's published makes an argument of some kind. You know, they're trying to support one claim or another, or show that a given claim is false or is likely to be false on the basis of some data that they report. And in those cases, the data and some other kinds of reasoning considerations, some of which might appear in like the discussion section of a scientific paper, that the data and those elements in the discussion section are working like premises to support the conclusion that's the main conclusion of the article, okay, of the argument made in the article. So again, arguments are extremely common. They're made very frequently. Probably most pieces of nonfiction writing include some arguments. So it's nice once you recognize that to kind of be on the lookout for arguments, because if you can identify them, then and notice what are the premises and what are the conclusions, then you can also do things like ask whether the premises are ones that we should adopt, are true. And you can ask whether the premises really support the conclusion, whether the premises provide enough support for the conclusion, and thereby evaluate the arguments that are made. Okay, so having talked about arguments, objections, and replies in general, I would now like to focus in on some objections to Aristotle and possible replies from Aristotle. So a first objection is, why think that there must be a chief good, as Aristotle has asserted in Book 1, Section 1 of the Nicomachean Ethics? Remember that Aristotle said that everything that we do for some reason, aiming at some end or some good for that particular activity, and that some of the activities are done for the sake of other activities, which in turn are done for the sake of ends. And so then he asks, well, either this sequence of ends goes on to infinity and it doesn't have any ultimate end, or it does have an ultimate end. And the idea that it goes on to infinity and doesn't have an ultimate end is absurd, he says, so it must be that it has an ultimate end, that everything aims at the same thing. But if we think about this a little bit more, it seems less obvious that it has to be the case that everything we do, we ultimately do for the sake of the same ultimate end. And in fact, we can come up with some examples, like imagine somebody who says that what they want most of all is to please God, however they understand God or believe that God is. And they don't want this just because they want to go to heaven and be rewarded, but they want this because they believe that God is good, and they want to, and that pleasing God is good, and they want to do that because it's an intrinsically good thing to do, okay? Well, that would make their chief good different from the chief good of somebody who is pursuing happiness, right? And so since we can come up with cases where the main thing that somebody's action is aiming towards is different from what Aristotle says the chief good of everybody must be, what he calls happiness, then it's questionable whether there really is one thing that all people's actions must aim towards, okay? We can ask the same question in a slightly more abstract and general way just by thinking about the way that the world is and the way that organisms are. Why does it have to be that every organism of a given species, like for instance human organisms, why would we assume it's the case that every one of those organisms is ultimately aiming at the same thing in everything that they do? It's not obvious that would have to be the case, right? Modern biology recognizes variation in organisms, even at the genetic level. So why would we assume that every member of a species has to be aiming at the same thing? And then when we also consider that human beings are particularly variable in terms of their personalities, partly because of how they're raised and the kinds of things that they're taught to value as they're growing up, it seems even more likely that we would expect human beings to be aiming at lots of different things with their actions, like for instance the person who says that they aim to please God. So if that's the case, then again we can't we'll be less convinced that there is and that there must be some one chief good that every human activity or every action taken by every human is ultimately aiming towards. Okay, so the next two objections that I want to consider are objections to Aristotle's own argument for his definition of happiness. So since these are objections to an argument, I want to just briefly look at his argument again and make the objections while looking at that argument. So this argument is made in Book 1, Section 7, and in a previous video lecture, I actually talk through this whole passage that's presented on the screen here and summarize the argument in detail. Here I'll just skip on to the next slide, which gives the overview of the argument itself. So here's the overview of the argument. It basically goes like this, okay? And I might simplify it even a little bit more in my verbal presentation now, but you have the longer description on the slide here. So basically it goes like this. everything that has a function, which includes different roles in society like flute players and sculptors, as well as organs like eyes or hands, everything that has a function also has a good, which lies in fulfilling their function. Okay, so if we want to ask what's good for human beings, if we want to find out what the chief good is for human beings, then we should ask about what the function of human beings is. Since if we can tell what the function of human beings is, that will give us the answer as far as what their good is. Okay, so this is an analogy that's drawn between these other things that have functions like roles in society and organs and human beings. Okay, so we're going to ask about what's the function of human beings as such. Another way of putting that is, what are human beings for? Okay, and then Aristotle argues, well, it can't be a life of nutrition and growth, since that's not unique to humans. And it can't be a life of perception, since that's also not unique to humans. Remember, Aristotle had said that plants and animals, their souls have certain features which are common to human souls. But human souls also have a distinctive feature, which is reason, logos. Okay, and so that is the next place that Aristotle goes in the argument. He says, well, reason or logos is unique to human beings. And so that can, in fact, be the function of human beings, since it's unique to them. So he goes on to say that it is, okay, that he's just assuming that that's what the function of human beings is. It's living in accordance with reason. And so the last point is to say that the difference between merely fulfilling a function and fulfilling it well is the difference between something being a particularly good instance of the thing that it is. So the difference between just an average flute player and a good flute player is that the good flute player does a really good job of fulfilling their function. So likewise, the difference between an average human being, one who hasn't done a maximally good job of achieving the chief good, and a really good human being, one who's done a really good job of achieving the chief good, okay, is the difference between one who does a really good job of fulfilling their function or not. Again, since the function of human beings is to live in accordance with a rational principle, then that means that the chief good for human beings is to do a really good job of living in accordance with a rational principle. Okay, and so that's the conclusion of the argument. The definition of happiness, or the chief good, ends up being the chief good for human beings ends up being doing a really good job of living life in accordance with a rational principle. And life here should be understood as something common to humans and plants, and also in this case to animals, since humans are animals, they have a life of sensation as well as a life of sentience, perception, the things that animals have and do, as well as a life of logos. And when I covered this argument earlier in the video lectures, I asked you to think about whether you think this is a good argument and whether you see any problems with it. And in some of the posts to the discussion boards, students have noted problems with this argument. So now what I'd like to do is highlight two problems that I see with the argument that are particularly big problems. So the first problem is this. Premises 3 and 4 rule out a life of nutrition and growth or a life of sentience as possible functions of human life. And they rule them out because Aristotle says they're not unique to humans. But that line of reasoning, if you think about it, actually doesn't make that much sense. For instance, it's the function of scissors to cut, and it's also the function of a knife to cut. Does that mean that, I think that's probably how we would describe those functions initially, at least. And so the question is, have we made a mistake in saying that the function of scissors is to cut, since it's not unique to scissors that they cut? That seems wrong. It's the function of chopsticks to help us to eat. It's the function of forks to help us to eat. Well, if we describe both forks and chopsticks in that way, does that mean that we have describe them inaccurately because it's not unique to chopsticks that their function is to help us to eat. Okay, so the point there is that something can have a function even if it can have a function of a certain kind, or its function can be a certain thing, even if that thing is not uniquely the function of that thing. And a way to put this in reference to human beings is, we don't know for sure, just based on the reasons that are given here, okay? We don't know that the function of human beings isn't actually a life of nutrition and growth. And that reason, maybe reason just is like the way that we do that, or it's what allows us to do that. Another way to put it would be, we don't know whether our function is a life of nutrition and growth, and reason is actually a kind of accidental byproduct, maybe even something that like gets in the way. Okay, reason could be a kind of like disease or a kind of peculiar development in our particular evolutionary track that we've gone along, but it's not one that really tells us anything about what our function is. Okay, so I'm not saying I actually believe any of those things. I'm just saying that the argument that something can only be our function if it's unique to us is not very convincing when you think about it more carefully. Now, the other objection that I think is very serious that can be made to this argument is that the analogy between human beings and these other things that have functions, like particular roles in society or organs like the eye and the hand, that analogy is potentially doesn't work. Okay, if you think about it, if you ask, why do we think that sculptors or flute players have functions? Well, they're given those functions by their role in society. Likewise, think about tools for a minute, like scissors or knives or hammers. Why do they have functions? Well, they're given their functions by the people that make them and use them. Okay. And then what about organ systems like eyes or hands or stomachs? Why do they have functions? Well, because they serve a certain role in the life of an organism that helps to keep that organism alive. And today we might also say, though Aristotle, there weren't really evolutionary theories in Aristotle's time, but today we could also say because they've evolved that way to serve that function, okay? But if we ask, what is the function of a given organism? Like, what's the function of a dog, or what's the function of a cow, or what's the function of a tree, okay, a plant? It's hard to answer that question. We might say, well, it could have a function, like a tree could have the function of giving shade for the people who planted the tree, or for the people who use it as shade in their yard. Just like a fruit could have the function of food for a dog that eats the fruit, okay? But what the function of the thing is in itself, what's the function of fruit as such, or what's the function of that plant as such, or what's the function of the tree as such? It just strikes us as kind of odd in a contemporary world. There's nothing that an organism is for. The closest thing that we could say from a contemporary biological standpoint, probably the closest thing we could say that an organism is for from a contemporary standpoint, the closest thing we could say is an organism's function, is something like to propagate its genes or to make more of itself in the next generation. But if that's the case, then there really isn't any reason to suppose that human beings have a distinctive function, right? We don't need to suppose that every organism, every type of organism, every species has its own distinctive function. So what has gone wrong here? Why is Aristotle so convinced? If we can see that there's potentially a problem and that it's not obvious that any type of organism has a function, is for anything, then why would Aristotle have thought that that was true? Well, if we look again at Aristotle's cosmology, remember that he thought that everything in the universe has a natural end that it's tending towards, including fire and water and the planets and so on. And that framework, that way of thinking about things, is kind of naturally leads a person to think that every type of thing in the universe must have a natural function. Again, thinking that everything must be aiming at something. And each type of thing must be aiming at a distinctive thing, because that's part of what defines it as the type of thing that it is. But from a contemporary scientific perspective, that assumption is very questionable. And so that's why, again, this is a pretty strong objection to Aristotle's argument here. So if these are pretty strong objections to Aristotle's argument, then have we just shown that Aristotle's definition of happiness is no good? Well, I think not exactly. And contemporary Aristotelians are very much aware of these objections, and they have a way of defending Aristotle and Aristotle's general way of thinking about what happiness is that avoids these problems. So I'd now like to just briefly describe to you what that way is. If we accept that there's nothing about the uniqueness of an attribute to an organism of a certain kind that shows that it must be its function or part of its function. And if we also accept that even the idea of things having natural functions is problematic, okay, then that is entire organisms having natural functions, then what can we say in defense of Aristotle's view? Basically, I think we can formulate it slightly differently like this. We can say we should emphasize reason and living a good, rational animal life as the definition of happiness, as Aristotle does, because it's natural for human beings to live a life that involves reason in this way. Reason is one of our natural attributes. It may not be unique to us. Maybe other animals also can reason, and it may not be the only thing that is part of our human nature and that needs to be paid attention to when we're asking what it is that makes us happiness. And even Aristotle recognizes that, because he recognizes that a certain amount of health and ability to procreate and so on, which are more animal kinds of features of our type of life, that these things also have to be satisfied in order for us to be fully happy. So he recognizes this kind of animal component as well as the rational component. But the point is that even if we give up on the idea that the uniqueness of reason to human beings is somehow important for saying what our function is and what type of life is good for us, we can still acknowledge that reason is a natural part of our lives. It's a natural part of a healthy, normal human life, okay? And so that a good human life will be one that does a good job of accommodating or including that natural part of our lives, okay? And notice that when I've been talking about what's natural for us or normal for us, or what makes for a good life for us as the type of organism that we are, then I'm also presenting a potential solution to the problem about functions. So a more modern way to think about what Aristotle was saying there is to think about, every time he talks about the function of human beings, rather to think about that in terms of what's natural for human beings, or what fits well with our type of organism, our type of organic life, or the type of life of an organism of our kind and our species, okay? So it's a way of thinking of the standard as being something like human nature, rather than the function that we serve, or the natural function that we have, okay? It's more like our nature, or a natural pattern of life, or a pattern of life that is healthy for us, that constitutes a good life for an organism of our type.